Hello and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of IndieViews, which will be our 2024 season. In case you haven't listened to IndieViews before, I am your regular host, Connell Suter, and on IndieViews we speak to indie developers about their incredible games. To kick off Season 2, I've had the absolute pleasure of speaking with Lucy Blundell, aka Kinmoku, about the phenomenal game VIDEOVERSE. VIDEOVERSE is a super cool game and one that I've really enjoyed playing myself despite not typically being a visual novel player. VIDEOVERSE puts you in the role of Emmett, a teenager spending their time on the VIDEOVERSE forums in around 2003. As you can tell by that brief intro, the game evokes the mid-uh-ohs and brings you back to an earlier version of the internet that many may have now forgotten or not experienced. In VIDEOVERSE, you spend your time chatting to friends, interacting with other users, creating art, and reporting trolls. It captures pretty much every aspect of those young internet forum days and brings you in as the player with important decisions and dialogue options that truly immerse you in the world of VIDEOVERSE. In the interview, you'll hear me say the word genuine around 100,000 times, but despite my repetitiveness and apparently limited vocabulary, it really is an apt description. The game feels so right in a way that is hard to describe without playing it. From the endlessly impressive characterizations of other users and their art, all the way to the conversations you have with friends and the choices you make, it all feels correct, and that allows the experience to truly immerse the player, which basically never happens to me with visual novels. Lucy and I talk about every aspect of the game in the interview, with Lucy providing fascinating insight into their approach to many aspects of the design and how they came to even make VIDEOVERSE. So, without any further preamble from me, let's get chatting with Lucy. So I'm joined here today by Lucy Blundell from Kinmoku. Lucy, how's it going?
It's going well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really excited to chat about VIDEOVERSE, which is an amazing decision-based narrative adventure game that we're here to talk about today. So I guess to start us off, we may as well start with the beginning. Could you give us a little bit of a background on yourself in the games industry and Kinmoku?
Yeah, sure. So Kinmoku is my online alias. I have worked in video games now for 14 years, which is really hard to believe, and 9 of those have been as an indie developer. Before that, I worked at EA Chilingo as a graphic designer. So I worked on, for those that don't know, Chilingo was a mobile game publisher that then got acquired by Electronic Arts, and Chilingo published like the original Angry Birds and Cut the Rope. Contre-Jour was another kind of indie puzzle game. And then they had like bigger IPs like He-Man. There was quite a large game called Iron Force as well. So yeah, I did like graphic design work for them, like looking at the screenshots for the stores, the icons, like advertisements, even like event displays, all that kind of stuff. So I was there for about 5 years. And I saw like we would publish like sometimes 2 games a week, so it was a lot of games coming through, and I just felt like I'd seen so many indie games that I just felt really confident to kind of do it myself, and it was something that I always wanted to do but didn't feel like I could do, mostly because I don't have, well, at that point I didn't have any like programming knowledge, but I was very confident after working there for so long, like what makes a good game, like what makes it fun, and also confident in like the art and the marketing side of things. So I was like, right, I'm gonna take the plunge, and I'm gonna teach myself RenPy and Python and how to make visual novels, because I've always been interested in like telling stories. Before like I got into making video games, it was more like comics and drawings and things like that, but then visual novels felt like a really nice fit for me. So my first released visual novel was called One Night Stand, and that is on like PC, Mac and consoles, and it did really well with like YouTubers especially, and then I released VIDEOVERSE last year, but I do have a few kind of unfinished projects as well that have never released.
No doubt, that's the typical indie pipeline, I guess, of 50 ideas that never quite get to the full thing. That's super cool, though. Like, it's funny to say good for you, but honestly, that's like, I think there's so many people who never get to the point of having programming knowledge enough to make games. I know that I'm bad for it, and even I did do programming when I was younger, but I just didn't like it. And even still, right. I love exactly the same as you. I love writing stories and telling stories, and love games, and games is the format for it. But I'm just not got the brain for it. Or maybe I do one day, and you have the motivation you do. That's amazing. And super cool to start with icons for stores as well. That's quite a specific role to end up having.
Yeah. It didn't start like that. Like, Chillingo had their own kind of social network thing that was called Crystal, and each Chillingo game had it. So this was before, like, Apple had Game Center and achievements and things.
Oh, sure.
So they kind of made their own version of this. And I would kind of create the skins for that. So I'd also be doing, like, UI kind of work. I did loads of odd jobs, basically, because it was quite a small company. So that helped, yeah.
That's cool. I guess it really sets you up for making some amazing games. And this all makes sense why Videoverse looks so good, which is the game we're here to talk about today. It genuinely does. I absolutely love the look of the game, both in terms of, and now we're getting specific, but with the UI within Videoverse itself, but also the look of the character of Emmett and the world kind of outside of the computer as well. It's so beautiful. But I guess, now we're talking about Videoverse, which is a really, really fun game. I absolutely loved it. And anyone listening who maybe hasn't played visual novels or has only played a couple, this is a fantastic one. And it's one that really pulled me into the entire genre. So I guess, without any more praise, could you give us kind of a quick intro to Videoverse and maybe a bit of the background to what led you to make it?
Yeah, so, I mean, as you said, like, it is a decision-based narrative adventure game, and it focuses on kind of friendship and love in this online space that's very much inspired by Miiverse and MSN Messenger and even like old school message boards. It's set in 2003, which is like, I feel like it's this pivotal moment between not having the internet and where we are today. So I think it's quite an interesting time. And you play as Emmett, who is this like teenager. He's a video game fan and an aspiring artist. And as playing as him, you kind of explore this, or Videoverse, the social network of this fictional console called the Kinmoku Shark, which, I use my alias name for that. And throughout the game, you kind of make these decisions that will change how Emmett grows, how Videoverse kind of, does it become more toxic or more friendly. And then it will like change the final outcome. So there's a few different like variations on the endings. And it's really like ultimately a game about how video games inspire us and can be a force of good in our lives. And of course, like the human connection that comes with that. And it took me like 3 years to make, and critically it's received like really good reviews and everything, so really
no doubt. I mean, I would be too. It's fantastic. As I say, it's and to say all this about the art being amazing, and this guy's kind of faultless, and at least from my time with it, I absolutely love. I think the writing on it's fantastic. We'll talk more about that later on, because the writing, both in terms of the character but also what you do with the message boards and stuff, is a very difficult thing to do. Like, I think it's something that people can easily look. It's if you do it well, no one notices. If you do it badly, everyone notices. And it's one of those things you can look at and go, oh yeah, it looks like a message board. And it's like, but this is if it's written by one person, that's so hard to do. And it does have such a real feel to it. It really does feel like a real message board. And I mean, I'm a sucker for kind of fake old style graphics, but the shark intro and the little tune it plays is amazing.
I have that on my Steam Deck. When it loads up, really? I have the little shark thing.
That's amazing. Can you release that for other people to install on Steam, or is that like you have to put it on the back end?
Someone did it themselves and then showed me. They were like, "Oh, I have my Steam Deck. Do this," and I was like, "I didn't know you could do that."
That's so cool.
think there's a guide online. You can take the video file out of the game if you have it, and then use that. But Yeah, it was a little bit complicated, but it was so worth it.
That's awesome. It also feels like something that you don't get to do anymore. Like you kind of jerry-rigging together a bit like a file from a game. It's very 2003. So
yeah, it totally is.
Perfect. And yeah, so I love the setting of it. And obviously it's one of these where I always have to look at games like this and go, I am the perfect age demographic for this. I have to remember that like it's not made for me, but it almost could be. It was such an amazing time for games, and it's a point I hadn't even thought of that you mentioned about. It's that kind of, it's the crossover point between the internet becoming ubiquitous from this very niche element in the 90s. So was that crux of that issue the reason that you wanted to set it in the early 2000s, or was it other inspiration?
I think that was a big part of it, because I think before then, like, the internet was very niche. Like, people didn't have access to it easily, and around this time we were starting to see things for like the more general public. I don't think MySpace was too far behind, being kind of probably one of the bigger first social medias. So yeah, it felt like kind of a precious time. I think maybe it feels like that to me because I was like the similar age to the characters. I think I was like 15, 16 or whatever around that time. So I was online a lot as well. So to kind of get into the feel of the characters, it's like I think I had to kind of transport myself back in time and try and remember how I felt when I was like using MSN and things like that. So I think it just helped me write a better story, really. Yeah.
I guess that's a great point, is that anything relatable to the writer is going to make it better. But yeah, and that makes sense because it feels so genuine, and exactly that of MSN Messenger days. So quickly you're transported back to it. Even in terms of what we'll talk about later on about trolling and stuff, the way it even comes across is very of that time, which is actually, frankly, like, it feels anyway, is less horrible than today. This bizarre look back where you're like, man, mean people were better then. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's absolutely, I love it. So, and I guess that's to take that further then from just the time period, is capturing that feel of those early social networks, and then within that game communities, it is a thing we don't really have now, probably because of how accessible the internet is. You don't have these little pockets to the same extent. Obviously, certain games still have cult followings, but frankly, they're more open places, which is great, but that easier to access does take away a little bit of almost the magic of it, I guess. It's not an easy subject for a game, though, to do it on social networks and to focus on building a visual novel, I guess, around not just like the UI of a system, but also that it's not linear at all. You're not just talking to one person and having it. You're kind of constantly interacting with everyone on this platform. Obviously with direct messages with your friends and stuff, with the little video chats, which are wonderfully animated as well. But I guess, was it just that personal experience that made you want to make a game about those early social networks and that feeling, or was there something more sort of technical you wanted to approach with it?
It's quite a big question. So I think, yes, I've had this kind of, online connection idea, or ideas rather, like bubbling for years, because I'm very much an always online kind of person. Before like, Twitter and TikTok or whatever it is now, it was like games. It was like World of Warcraft for me. That was a huge thing. DeviantArt before then, and message boards like when I was really young, it was like Pokemon message boards, Final Fantasy, Sailor Moon, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I spent a lot of time online. So I thought, like, I'll be playing to my strength here if I write a story about this. But generally, like, I think I just tend to come up with kind of weird ideas for games. Like One Night Stand is an example of this. Like, oh, it seems to be something that doesn't really exist. There is like other interface games, as I like to say, like there's Hypnospace Outlaw, Hollow Vista, LostMemories.net, games that I was playing a lot of around the time of like coming up with Videoverse, or rather these ideas of how could I tell an online game. because I was basically working on a game that didn't release. The working title was called Memories, and I had the idea for VIDEOVERSE whilst I was developing that, and I spent like 3 years on this game and haven't finished it. So it was quite a lot of work that hasn't seen the light of day in a way, but a lot of the kind of development of that is in VIDEOVERSE. So like characters from that game, games even in that game are in VIDEOVERSE. So it's like it was like this practice kind of game almost.
That's cool. And
the drawing mechanic is a big part of that as well. So there was, in Memories, there was this like moment where you draw, and in Ren'Py it's a visual novel engine. It's not really designed for drawing, but the people on like the Ren'Py community forums had come up with like, oh, how can we do a drawing in Ren'Py? And the first kind of iteration of it was black and white, and I looked at it and I was like, that looks like the drawings on Miiverse. And I was like, a Miiverse visual novel, like, would that be like a dating sim or a love story? What would this be? And I was like, I really like that idea, but kind of shelved it. And then when Memories just wasn't feeling right. It was quite a personal project. Then the pandemic happened, and I was like, I don't really want to make this. It was quite a serious, sad game. So I don't really want to do this. I want to do something that's a bit more, I don't want to call VIDEOVERSE like a happy game, but it has like silly moments, and it's definitely a much more like brighter than Memories was. So yeah, like there was this whole other game going on, and I just was looking back at that idea of the Miiverse visual novel, and I'm like, Miiverse had such a sad, dramatic ending to it.
It really did.
I know. And I only used it casually myself, but I felt really sorry for like, and that's the thing, like the people that were using it the most tended to be teenagers, tended to be young people wanting to connect about things that they really loved, and they have the spare time for it. So I'm like, oh, like I've never seen this game about like a death of a community, like an online community. And I was like, that just seems perfect for like this kind of teenage love story or coming of age story. So then I was just like, yes, I have to do that idea. Yeah,
that's so good. It's such a good middle point, like of meeting of ideas. Like that is, because the end of Miiverse is like such a weird, like as you say, tragic, and this like really, like the kind of thing that people were going on it who had never been on it before, but then were sad they hadn't been on it.
Yeah.
And people just do all these just like outpouring of images of like, don't destroy the Miiverse, don't kill us. And I love that in some ways VIDEOVERSE is going to capture it for future generations who will probably never know that Miiverse existed. But it is fascinating, isn't it, as well, because of the always online nature of as things progress, things kind of don't end now. Things kind of just peter out, and you'll get a small community that never really leaves, but never goes back.
That tends to be how it goes, yeah. Because even like World of Warcraft is still going, but totally. I don't use it, and other websites, you know, people kind of go off them. Whereas Miiverse was like, nah, this is the last day, and then it's gone. And it's just like, that's brutal. It's kind of like what happened to Vine, I guess. Like, people love Vine because it just came to a sudden end.
Totally. Yeah. It's crazy to think about Vine in the modern sense, and like you can't imagine that happening to anybody else. No. I always think of Matrix Online as well, where they did a huge event and they did like get everyone online, as many players as possible, to see the end of the Matrix.
Oh, no
and
way.
It's such a fun idea, and you're like, man, if more games were prepared to do stuff like that, it would be a lot of fun. If every Ubisoft game 3 years after releasing had a big death event. Yeah, it'd be a lot of fun. And I guess to take it away from the end of online communities, instead to kind of focus on the thrust of the game's character, Emmett. I really loved Emmett. I thought he was so much fun to spend time with. Because he both, and again, this is like a real commendation to the writing, is he feels very genuine in a very human sense, but also as someone that was a teenage boy around that time. He feels exactly like I would have felt as a teenage boy online, both in terms of being probably a little bit overly sensitive to people's comments, but also kind of the interactions you have and getting the amount of joy even it feels like Emmett gets from the interactions and fun stuff. So I guess first is, what attracted you to writing Emmett as a main character?
So I think really Emmett is a lot like me, especially like that sensitive, that kind of nervous tendency and the anxiety of posting things, and that's totally me. I get that now, even though my job is trying to put games and promote them online. But like later in the game, like he gets, I mean, it depends how you play him, but he generally like is quite a supportive, loving character, and I think that side of him is like very much like my husband. So he's like kind of like both parts of us, our better parts, I'd say. I think like even if you play him a little bit like cocky or kind of a bit more like a teenage boy, he's still very empathetic, and he still wants to try and help people. That's always how the story will go. He also is, his dad is from England and his mum is from Germany, and when he was like 6 years old, he moved back. He moved from the UK to Germany, and that's not really in the game, but we do see him like say like German words, and most of the words that he says in German are like swear words, and that's because like he'll he's grown up, like he's learnt these words whilst he's growing up as a teenager in Germany. So I like kind of scattering in like where he is from now, and the fact that he is bilingual, and like just adds a bit more of like a depth to him. I know like a lot of bilingual people kind of, they do go between languages a lot, and it just makes him feel kind of genuine. He's not like, and a big reason for like why he's online connecting on Videoverse in the first place is to kind of connect to the people, or to connect to like English people or English speaking people. He can practice his language more and connect with people that from where he was born and can no longer relate easily access. So yeah, like it gives him a reason to be online. Every kind of character in Videoverse has a reason to be there, whether it's like a long distance relationship, or because they're stuck at home, or in Emmett's case, like he wants to talk to English people again, and also like, I don't know about you, but I really don't like kind of blank slate protagonists that don't really say anything.
Totally.
Because I don't think it's very relatable at all. Like some of my favourite games, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, you have this protagonist that just doesn't say anything, and I'm like, you're the worst part of this game. I wish you had a personality that I could shape and make that rewarding. I think it might not seem obvious, but like my favorite kind of video game protagonist is probably like Commander Shepard in Mass Effect.
Yes.
And how you can like shape them to be like, the renegade or the paragon. And it's not exactly the same in Videoverse, but it's like, oh, I want there to be a character he is himself, but you can steer him in like this direction. So yeah, that was kind of like the thought when I was making Emmett.
It's so interesting that you say that, because like when you said at the start about like it's the choices you make, I was like, oh wait, of course I could have been a dick that whole time. I was like, but no, I just was always like, as if I would be. I was like, no, I'd always be this like kind of overly worried, sensitive responses.
Yeah.
Which totally.
And that's
perfect.
the thing, like that option is in there, but most people do choose the kind of kind and sensitive route.
Well, that's nice.
Which is fine. Yeah.
Which is probably the opposite, unfortunately, to Mass Effect, where Renegade very much became the cool thing to be in the second and third games.
Yeah.
I love that. That makes so much sense as well, to see that inspiration point of Shepard, because I agree. I think like there's a huge amount about that I think has in common with Emmett, which is like in every game I'll always play as characters that aren't like me. If I'm ever playing RPGs,
Right.
I'll always usually play a female character and do something different, other than Mass Effect, where I remember inviting my mum and my sister in to help me design the character to look like me. And it was the way that I feel about Commander Shepard's character progression is unbelievable. It's almost incomparable to other games. And I totally get the renegade choice. There is a bit of a renegade Emmett option, and it is the Paragon. And then I guess really it's more like Paragon being also a bit nervous, unlike Mass Effect.
Yeah.
But that's so much fun. I love that. And yeah, I love the little throw-ins of German as well. It does make it feel incredibly genuine. And it's funny because for me, the reason it feels genuine is completely different to the reason that Emmett's character does it, of being sort of truly bilingual in a different country. But I remember at high school, when we started doing German, everybody loved German swear words.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Right? It's like everyone used to walk around saying Scheiße, and I think most people didn't realize it was a real word. They thought they had made it up.
It's funny now because, I live in Germany and you walk around and sometimes you'll just hear it and it's just like, it just sends me back to teenage years.
Totally. I don't know why it was so popular. But that it really, again, it has, the whole game has such in every aspect, both the UI and the look of it, but also the writing, and it feels so genuine, and like it kind of triggers a little bit of a memory, even if it's not kind of a direct memory. For instance, if people haven't used MSN, they'll totally still get all that chat program feeling, and the feeling of like chatting with your friends, especially when they're teasing you about girls messaging you and things like this. I love it. And I guess that leads us on nicely to the next question, which is, one of the things I really like about, and it's in a lot of the descriptions about Videoverse as well, is that you talk about making like a real depiction of the internet, and that has to come along with some warnings as well. But that's not an easy thing to do. I think it's interesting, we've talked about Hypnospace Outlaw, which doesn't try in any way to be a real one, and it is very kind of silly, and like it's a warped version of what the internet was at that time. Whereas Videoverse does such a good job of feeling like a real thing that could have existed, and as I say, in the way people interact as much as the message board itself. So I guess, why did you really want to make it real as opposed to making something a bit more kind of imagined or fluffy, if you get what I mean? And I guess the hard line there of like, how did you make it feel good and not end up feeling like too real or too fake, or how did you get that perfect middle point?
It's a good question, because I feel like it's just the way I made it. It's almost like like it's just,
no doubt though, totally.
it just ended up that way. I think like really, like Videoverse is set on this fictional console that didn't exist, that has very bad graphics for the era that it is portable system. So I was thinking of like Game Boy.
Totally.
And I tend to think of like, oh, what if instead of chasing realistic graphics like we do in our world, what if they chase like more functionality? So this system has the internet like the Dreamcast did, but it also has like a touch screen that you can draw on, kind of like the Nintendo DS did. And I was like, oh, I want it to have like all these things. So it ended up being like quite strange. It's quite a strange device compared to like what we have in our timeline, as it were. Whereas this is like an alternate Nintendo timeline, some people have called it. So it was already a bit weird, I guess, and it needed to be grounded in reality somewhere. So if I kind of created a fluffy, really wholesome kind of internet, it just would have felt a bit I guess like dull and inaccurate, and you'd be like, this isn't what the internet's like. Like I don't feel like you can tell a story about the internet and not show the ugly sides of it, because the internet's very double-edged. It's some people are like, oh, we should get rid of it, we should get rid of social media, all this is bad, and I'm like, I disagree. I know where you're coming from, because the internet can be terrible. And there's a lot of misinformation on there, and hate speech even. But like, there's a lot of people as well that rely on it for human connection, for finding jobs, for accessing like loads of things. And people that are disabled or unable to kind of communicate clearly, or whatever it is, like it's a very nice lifeline for a lot of people. So it's like, well, I just, to be able to tell this story, I need I just need to be real with it. I need to, it's in this weird fictional world, but the internet is very relatable. Anyone that's kind of used the internet, hopefully, I hope, can play Videoverse and get something out of it, you know? And then it's also nice to, like, you know, if the game didn't have the trolls, you wouldn't have this sense of, like, I guess, like, righteousness. Like, yes, I can make a difference. I can make Videoverse nicer. I can, like, report these guys, and, you know, if they get banned, it's such a great feeling. It's, like, one of the best points in the game. Like, yes, I got rid of that guy. It's just a really nice thing to add, I guess.
It so is, though. Like, it really, report in the minute does feel great. I had to leave Twitter years ago because it just, all your life ends up being reporting people. And it's unbelievable. It takes so long to hear back on anything anyway. But when you do get that message, you're like, good, I'm glad I've helped clean it up.
Yeah.
And it is, you're so right. That Videoverse does that so well. You really do feel it. Like, you're like, I'm gonna get this guy. Really searching them out. I really enjoyed that as well. The way that, like, because of the way that it kind of, the progression works, it is kind of saying to you, go and have a look through, go find stuff. And when you find someone being a dick, and you're like, oh yes, I've got them now. I love that. Yeah, that's super cool. I think that's like a very admirable thing to do, though, as well, because I think it's easy to go one way or the other, and a lot of depictions end up being all dark. Which is, you know, often their whole story is dark, and that's fair enough. Or the other way, as you say, and it ends up being this kind of wholesome, very safe environment, which doesn't evoke in the real world and doesn't make you feel immersed, really. I think, as you say, just because it feels so false.
Yeah, I did have, like, troubles with not so much troubles with age ratings, but because ultimately the story of Videoverse, apart from the odd swear word, is quite wholesome. But because I've gone for this realistic depiction, it kind of, like, it was like shooting myself in the foot a bit, because, you know, it didn't really get included in, like, wholesome or cozy game kind of collections. Or I even had one reviewer be like, sorry, but looking at your age rating and your trigger warnings and everything, we don't think this is a game for us. And it's like, oh, but I still think you'd love it, you know. Like, I'm just, you use the internet, right? It's just totally. The internet, which loads of people have access to, you know, children have access to. So yeah, it's like, oh, if I'm trying to, like, make something about the internet, it is gonna kind of cost me a bit. And I even had, like, because in Videoverse there's, like, advertisements, and I really wanted to capture that, like, early 2000s, these adverts are inappropriate for, like, for children or for women to see. You know, they're just, like, it's a very male dominated game space. Totally. And that was, like, really important for me to try and get that across. But even Steam had, like, a problem with one of the adverts. They were like, this is, like, bumping up the sex and nudity, like, bit, like, way too high. Basically the age rating just, like, skyrocketing, and I'm all just like, okay, I guess I have to tone down this advert. So yeah, like, I did have to, you know, and that goes for, like, the writing as well. There were parts that I just had to soften, because I didn't want to make it too ugly, I guess. Like, I didn't want people to have a miserable time.
Yeah, I guess that's a tough line to do as well. It's funny, is I when I hear this, I always end up going, oh, these people are too sensitive. And I think about how sensitive I am. And then I'm like, well, I guess they're just a bit more sensitive than me, and that's fine. But then I'm like, God, I'm that sensitive, and I can handle the game. You know, I'm sure they can as well. Like, this is it with cozy games. I think that's the idea that this isn't a cozy game is crazy. It absolutely fits into the category of cozy games. It's definitely you could sit down with a glass of wine and just have a lovely evening playing it. And it's so interesting. I really like that, actually. I'd kind of forgotten about it, but having to report the guy on the forum for saying, like, about mums shouldn't play games because she posted this art for playing with her kid. And it's a weird one because we're not past that problem still. Like, there totally is still an undercurrent of it, but I think people now wouldn't realize how prevalent it was. Like, I remember when I was at school, and there was not a single girl that would admit she played games, because if she did, everyone would have been weird about it. And not, like, in what fashion that would have been, who knows, but they would have been weird about it. Yeah. There would have at least been being called a nerd and stuff, like, you know, us nerdy guys were. But Yeah, it's very interesting to think about that. As much as we've come far, yeah, a very interesting
that
thing.
was the thing, because like when I was writing it, it's like, well, some things I really tried to capture how people wrote back then, even how people wrote smileys or
Yeah, I love
emojis
that. Yeah,
was a bit
totally.
different. But then I remember writing that bit like, oh, moms play games. And I was just like, God, I feel like I could just go on to Reddit today and get like this kind of comment.
Totally.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, really. But
It's interesting. It feels like it's gone from just like then it was like a casual ignorance of people being weird, whereas now it's like pointed ignorance, like they are purposefully doing it. Yeah, absolutely. It's very weird. And it's funny as well, you know, because right after playing it, literally after that bit was kind of the last thing I'd done that evening playing the game. The next day, I spoke to my mom and she was asking me, "Is there any new version of Myst she can play?" And I was like, "We're fixing it. We're getting there." You know?
oh, it's really nice.
It's awesome. But I love it. I love that. It's such a good thing to evoke. Again, all these things. It's this all goes into, I guess, this feeling of genuineness that the game has in terms of just every element of it. It feels so thorough. And yeah, I guess to continue that as well, is the thoroughness also goes into gameplay. And one of the things I find interesting about it, as I said at the start, I don't play a lot of visual novels. It's not a genre that often appeals to me. But it doesn't feel like, I wouldn't even call it a visual novel almost for me, because when I play it, I think of Hypnospace Outlaw is the closest thing in my head. And while they're very different, to me, they're both kind of these puzzle games. And that partially goes into, I guess, the way you're going through the forums looking for comments or nice art to comment on and like someone else's comments or report some trolls, as we say. So I guess that kind of like choice-based approach and that puzzle feeling, maybe hard to define, but was that a goal that you kind of set when you were doing it, or was it just the choice-based, like we said with Mass Effect, and this extra kind of gameplay feeling is just a happy follow-on?
It's kind of both. I honestly really like visual novel. I like visual novels, whether they're linear or interactive, but I do tend to prefer the ones that do have like puzzle elements, like Ace Attorney or Zero Escape or like Danganronpa. Like they're like some of my favorites. And I also like want to advocate for visual novels, especially in the West. Like I wish they were more popular because they're quite cheap to make and they can tell some really moving stories, and I just think they're really cool. And I feel like maybe a way to get more, you know, to get them little bit more mainstream in the West is like make them a bit more gamey, you know, have like escape the room or like point and click elements, or in VIDEOVERSE's case it has like reporting and you can change your avatar and you can write different comments and all that kind of stuff. It's also, I think you mentioned earlier, like it's not very linear. And yeah, it's like there is obviously like a main story, but it has like all this kind of optional, there's like side quests, there's things to unlock, you know, like the themes and like avatar gear. There's like, you can just ignore like certain parts of it if you don't want to interact with it. And if you do, there'll be a consequence of that. Like Videoverse will get a bit more toxic if you're not kind of keeping on top of it. So yeah, it's like, that's why I try and describe it as a narrative adventure, because you're doing lots of different things, but at the same time, like, it does get kind of called a visual novel because when you kind of get down to the main story where you're talking in the private chats, it's very, there's a lot of reading, probably a lot more than like Hypnospace Outlaw or similar games like that. So yeah, it is kind of like a happy thing that also like it became more interactive as time went on because it had to. It's like, if I want this to feel like a real messenger or a real social network, it does need these like random elements, these messages and notifications and things coming in. And yeah, it's like I had a lot of help actually from a programmer that I am a solo developer and I make pretty much everything myself. But with Videoverse, I was lucky enough to bring in like a few people. So my programmer, Depeche, was able to kind of build this Videoverse system. So I'd be like, oh, I really want like a notification to come in, not immediately, maybe like a random amount, like 10 to 20 seconds kind of thing. Let's try and make it feel natural. So he'd do that kind of stuff. So I thank, I owe a lot to him really for making it feel so interactive. So yeah, it's kind of like I go in with this wanting to make it more of a game visual novel, but also it's kind of a consequence of making this kind of story. Yeah. And it took a lot longer to make because of that. I don't think I was prepared how non-linear it was going to become.
No doubt. I guess it's it's compounding, isn't it? Every choice then has a choice within it, and
and then it's like, oh, what if that message comes in before you've got the context of whatever these guys are talking about, and there were just so many variables going on, and it was a bit of a nightmare at times.
No doubt. Especially with that many ways of interacting, as you say, in different orders. Yeah, and like you could just find a post at a different time. Totally, it's going to change everything. That's so funny. I tried to write a game a few years ago in Twine, and it's funny as well. A very online life. It was all set by a guy not leaving his apartment and living there. But that was exactly what happened to me though, was writing, and it ended up being so many branches that I just confused myself and had to stop. But I love all that. It's so cool, and it's interesting actually. You compare it to Ace Attorney, because if you'd asked me, is Ace Attorney a visual novel, I would have said no, of course it isn't. It's a lawyer game. I'm like, that's not a genre. But I remember playing that when I was like 13, and I was so excited to get it just to shout objection. But it is, that's a great comparison actually of a very like non-linear visual novel, but then also that it does depend on kind of the way that you interact with it. You can easily just miss everything and go past it. That's really cool. And so you said you got help with doing some of the programming. If you didn't get help with the writing, I'm amazed, and the reason is because trying to write all these different characters, now people might hear that in terms of like, oh, but every story has different characters, but actually because these are messages on a message board, that's so much less time to characterize people, and you can't, in the way that a lot of stories just have them, a character saying, here's a bit of backstory that kind of justifies why I feel this way or does all this. You just don't have that much opportunity to do that in a message board format. So I guess, how did you approach making sure that these commenters felt like different people? And I guess with the art as well, because the art manages to feel of totally different skill levels, not just of different kind of inspirations. It's really impressive.
Yeah. So I guess I'll start with the art question. So I've been drawing since I could pick up a pen, really, and I've always felt like I've never really had my own art style, and I'm very good at if someone showed me a picture, they'd be like, Lucy, could you draw that? And I could just draw it, and I'd just be able to kind of mimic whatever I saw, and that's kind of like what happened here. It's like, oh well, what kind of art style should we have? So one of them is like a Simpsons art style. There's like a little character who draws like Simpson kind of characters, and then there's more anime stuff, and it's like, oh, what if it was a bit more like 90s anime? So it's like, oh, there's this character called Glitter Girl who has these really detailed drawings, and she's like really going, like, she's like the best artist on there. Vivi's pretty good as well, but is a little bit more like, she's not quite got everything right yet. Emmett's drawings are a bit more like mine, but unfiltered, like my first draft kind of thing, and also a little bit more inspired by shonen anime like Dragon Ball or just something like that, like because he's a teenage boy. And then there's people that can't draw as well, that just draw like stickman, and there were a few other game developer friends who did give me drawings as well, who have like little cameos in the game. And I thought that would be really nice to kind of make it feel not just me, like it is a little bit of a community. So yeah, like I felt like the drawing side of things was quite easy. it got a little bit harder when some of the drawings have like handwriting on them. I was like, oh, that character's handwriting looks exactly the same as that person's. So I had to go back in, and I remember like looking at like notes that people had left me, and you know, old letters, and being like, oh, that person like loops their Y's like that, and just tried to like
That's so cool.
tried to mimic people's handwriting, but I found that harder than the drawings. But yeah, like when it comes to the characters, I mentioned before, like my other game Memories had some characters, and then one of my other unfinished projects called Love IRL had a group of characters in it as well, so they're all in Videoverse as well. So some of these characters have been with me for like 9 years, so I know how they sound and I know how they speak. I think some of them are inspired by like World of Warcraft friends. Some of them are inspired by like friends that I had on DeviantArt. And then there were some people that, like, smaller characters that would only show up every now and then. And I'd be like, oh, what should they sound like? And literally, like, the internet, like, you just need to log on and go check Twitter or go on Reddit or something. And it's like, oh, that person types like that. They're really angry about something for some reason. Or that person's from, like, France and they, you know, maybe their English isn't quite right. Or just all those kind of things. And it's like I made like little character bios for like each person, each little Videoverse character, and I'm like, this person, you know, like making up like backstories, like this person's from Switzerland and she's like 12 years old and this is her first video game that she's playing, and then because of that she doesn't really know what she's doing, so she's asking in the forums for a lot of help, and her English is quite broken, and it's just like little things like that. And then I'd do like another character, like, oh, this guy's a troll, he's like 26 years old and he lives here and he just logs on because he's upset with like his job and he uses it as like a way to kind of, you know, lash out and all this kind of stuff. So it's like there's just all these little bios really. And I could just use that to draw from every time this character showed up. Like, oh yeah, I got to remember, like, keep that in mind. And then the more complicated NPCs that you see, that maybe part of the side quests, they tend to have a little bit of growth. So there's like one character called Meat Sandwich, and he has like he gets into the Feudal Fantasy forum. And he's like, oh, I really love this game. It stops me from thinking about my divorce. And then everyone's like, that's a weird thing to say. But then you can actually help this guy and help him get through like this depression that he's feeling through the divorce he's going through. So, and how video games are helping him with that. So it's like some of these characters do have growth as well. So that was really fun to write.
No doubt. That I'll just say that the thing you said about art sounds like witchcraft. As someone who cannot draw at all, the idea that you can mimic other people's, but also that like, even in terms of like imagining the character writing it, doing the art is such an interesting way of doing it. I love what you said about as well, like, the carrying characters over from like, I mean, obviously these are from unused titles, like you say, but there's a really interesting concept to that of like writing a pantheon of characters that do not relate to a story, but just relate to a world that you may want to write a story in one day. And then using that as a way of making it feel much more real is super, super interesting. That's really cool. And yeah, no, and the bios makes a lot of sense, like in terms of, especially for the way they interact online. I imagine you can kind of summarize some stuff about, as you say, the broken English and they're excited or don't know what they're doing. But that, yeah, it's one of those things that when you explain it, it's like, oh, okay, these are the steps you've taken. It's so impressive in the way it comes off in the game that honestly, it can't be captured in explaining it. I think genuinely, especially the art. Like, to think that you did most of that art, and as I say, it couldn't be from more different people if you'd asked me, you know, without knowing that.
I'm really glad, because it was always my concern of like, oh, this is going to look like just one person's done it. And then if that illusion ever, if that broke, then people would be like, oh, this isn't a community at all. And then totally. that's it, you know. So I was like, I have to make sure that everything looks different and everyone's got their own style. And yeah, there were a lot of like drawings that got deleted because maybe they looked too much like other people's drawings, or even that some of them were just a bit pointless. It's okay to have like a few kind of internet memes and silly things, but if I think the first versions of Videoverse felt like the communities were just full of kind of pointless like filler almost that didn't really need to be there. So I kind of like went back, like I kept playtesting it. I'm like, I'm just skipping over the forums and not bothering with these at all. And that's a problem because why are they there? So I had this big light bulb moment far too late into development of like, Emmett has his little phrase book where he's like, oh, someone said something really smart and I want to write this down. That was added quite late because I basically, the forums weren't doing much, and I'm like, well, how do I make it interesting? And the idea was, well, Emmett's a teenage boy and he doesn't know everything. He shouldn't know everything. He's young, but he can learn through people in Videoverse, like the guy with his depression who's going through the divorce, or like there's disabled characters on there, and I can talk to them and understand more about what they go through. And then he learns, and then he like writes it down, and then he's like, I can use this like later in the game to help people. And it just brought it all together, like, oh, the more you put into Videoverse, the more you get out of it.
Totally. And it really does feel that way. It comes across perfectly, and that's such an interesting balance to get. I hadn't even thought of that really, but with any platform like that, and there's a lot of games, I won't mention any specifically because it's a slightly negative comment, but that totally do that thing though. If they put too much in and it becomes like, it obfuscates the point, and you're like, okay, like now there's just so much stuff here that I feel lost, and feeling lost is never fun in a game. Yeah. Like, so it doesn't really work. That's such an interesting balance to try do. And just it's definitely the like discussion of disabled characters in it, I think is fantastic as well. I think it's something that like, it blows my mind that we're in 2024 and there are so many people that do not know anything about like accessibility or why it exists. And like there's a few episodes of IndieViews that I've been amazed with games that have taken concepts from very long running franchises and made them more approachable for disabled gamers. And it's like, wow, how's no one done this before? Why weren't these other games doing this already to make this more accessible? And this is my brother's who's disabled, has just bought his gaming PC, a new one for the first time in 10 years. So excited to be going through all these games, and definitely going to be recommending Videoverse to him actually. And I guess to continue with the thing about the way that Videoverse feels, there's a lot of choice in it, and it's really impressive as again for a visual novel how much choice it feels like there is. And I've not finished it yet, and not without spoilers, I guess, but kind of how different can it go by the choices? I mean, can Emmett become the monster at the end and murdering his own master?
So I did contemplate like, oh, what if you go too far like down the cocky, unkind kind of route, like but then I was like, well, then it would be game over, and I'm like, I hate that. It's okay in like a game where you're battling and you had a bad boss fight and you just got to restart, but when it's a visual novel and you've just spent like 4 or 5 hours and then you get a bad end, it's like, it's the worst feeling. Totally. It's like, what a waste of time. So I really wanted to avoid that. So the variations of like Emmett's personality, they're not, nothing's too drastic. There are like 2 ending scenes, but within those 2 endings there's still like variations. So it is difficult to talk about without kind of spoiling the ends, but Emmett can be played cocky or kind, lawful or unlawful, romantic or platonic, like how is his relationship deepening, and all of those kind of play out. Also like how much he kind of interacts with Videoverse, like as we said, like it can get more toxic, and if you don't interact or help it, it kind of just goes to like the trolls, and people, the posts get worse, the drawings get more kind of explicit, and people don't feel safe to be themselves on there, so they either log off or disappear, or you know, you don't see as cute drawings or posts anymore. So yeah, the endings are like, throughout the story we hear like Emmett in the future like kind of reminiscing on this, and it's kind of like, where does he end up? And there's just variations on it. There's also a character called Uncle from Kinmoku. I don't know if you've seen him.
I don't think so. I'm
okay.
like, I'd recognize the name.
Yeah. So he's someone in the communities that you can kind of talk to, and that's like a bonus ending in a way. Like if you go down that route, you'll find out what's going on with VIDEOVERSE itself and like the kind of corporate side of things. So there's that as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. That's super cool. And I love that. I think that's such a good direction to go with it. You know, obviously, I'm sure that you're happy with the direction you've gone with it, not to try to validate it, but that's it. It makes perfect sense, because you're like, totally. It's like, this guy's a teenage guy. He's not going to go so wrong that he's going to start, you know, being true evil, like in a video game sense.
Yeah, and even if he does like go a little bit like that, he still... The route is still the same, he just words it differently. Like, you can help people through kind of almost yelling at them like, shut up, what are you talking about? Like, don't say that about yourself. You can be more like rash. Or the other hand is like, he can be like, oh, I'm so sorry that you feel that way, like I wish I could do something, you know, like it's that kind of difference. So it's like he's still, the route is still the same, but things just play out differently. Yeah.
That's so cool. And I love the way, though, that it affects the platform. I think there's like, that's such an interesting commentary, especially with what we've even seen from like Twitter to X and the changes that's seen. And we thought it was bad already. And you're like, but actually, this is it. It's what happens if you keep going down an interesting path. So that's exactly. a really interesting thing. I don't think many games try to deal with that, of the effect on a platform like that, or the effect that people have on, I guess it's people on their environment, as much as the other way around, right? And that unfortunately brings us on to kind of a final question for the interview, which is just this has been so much fun talking about it, and one thing I really enjoyed about the game as well instantly was the feudal fantasy series that you've invented for it, and your first introduction to it is so cool and compelling. And as someone that hasn't watched much anime, and you know, my partner loves it, but I don't watch much of all this, I was like, oh, this is exactly the kind of like anime feel I want. This is so much fun. So I guess, how did you make feudal fantasy? Did you always know that it was going to be that kind of a game as the subject for VIDEOVERSE? And any plans to make a real feudal fantasy in the future?
Well, there's no plans for a real one, just because it'd be way too much work to get it to like where I'd want it. But yeah, like obviously it's a play on Final Fantasy, which is Final Fantasy VII is my favorite game of all time, and this like feudal fantasy came up in Memories, my unfinished game. It was like one of the characters' favorite games, and it had like it looked a bit different back then. It had like low poly, like Final Fantasy VII kind of characters. Right. Now it's like a pixel game, but yeah, like I had the idea of like, oh, the main character's Hattori Hanzo, and he was a real ninja samurai guy who, you know, had changed. I think he started as a samurai then changed into ninja, or even if that's not how the story goes, it's like, well, it's a fantasy game. We've got like these real Japanese like warlords and stuff, but we're adding like flares of like our own story. There's like a love interest and someone to protect, and there's like, you see fan art drawings of some of the monsters in the game that are very like fantasy. So it's just this kind of like, oh, it just seems like quite an easy idea, and because it's also kind of based in Japanese history, if people do know that, then they can get a little bit more out of it as well. It's like, oh, I know who that character is because he like backstabs this guy later, that kind of stuff. So it just felt like a really nice idea that you could show in these cutscenes as like nice breaks away from reading, because again, like I want to make a narrative or a visual novel game that's quite easygoing, and someone who's maybe not into those games can still enjoy it. So it was like these nice little cutscenes that also gave kind of how should I say, context really for what all these kids are talking about and what they're drawing and why are they so passionate about this game. It's like, oh, because it looks cool and this guy's just like killed his master and what's going on there. And the story actually runs parallel to like what's going on with Emmett and Vivi. Like Hanzo's quite troubled and going through, you know, he's got his problems, and it kind of mimics like what's going on with Vivi, that she needs help to kind of overcome her troubles as well. So yeah, that was the idea behind it.
It's great. I think it's emblematic of so much of the game in that it's kind of like some perfect choices. It's just perfectly chosen because like this is exactly it. Hattori Hanzo is one of my favorite historical figures because
cool.
It's just what a cool guy.
Yeah.
And you know, watching and knowing the history of him in the Sogoku Jidai is so interesting. And then, but he's also a semi-mythological character.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
Even in real life, we don't really know
Yeah.
that much about him, do we?
Yeah.
Like,
because like I was reading into it obviously, and it's like, oh, there were actually like rumors that he could do like mythical things, and it's like, well, what's true and what's not? Like, it just seems this perfect kind of world to build a fantasy around, and I guess that's why there are
Totally.
like certain games about this as well.
no doubt. I think it's why like Kill Bill is as a character called Hattori or Hanzo, and it's basically based on, you're like, clearly that's exactly how he felt. He was like, this guy's such a cool, interesting idea almost more than a man.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's so much fun that, and the art in it, like the way that the dramaticness of the feudal fantasy stuff is so cool. It really reminds me of like Yojimbo and Sojiro, that like real tense kind of samurai, you know, action. And you know, it's the only thing, my only, not even complaint about the game, but it took me far too long to realize it's a reference to Final Fantasy, because I got so stuck thinking it was reference to fighting fantasy. And then
I see.
was like, wait, hold on. I'm like, why would it be a reference to these like novels about, you know, like flicking back to page 386? I felt like an absolute idiot when I realized it was Final Fantasy.
Oh, no, but it's kind of nice to like think, oh, it was just its own thing, you know. It's
Totally,
nothing to do with Final Fantasy.
But it's so much fun, and I guess that, as I say, says a lot about the whole game. Videoverse is a fantastic game, and in so many ways it elevates the idea of a graphic novel, visual novel. I keep saying graphic, visual, but to that point where you said about like a choice-based kind of narrative adventure, I think is definitely the way to think of that game. And if anyone listening has played anything like this, like Hypnospace Outlaw and these kind of elements that kind of bring you back to a time of the internet as well that we're not in now, I can't recommend it enough. It's honestly such a fantastic game, and thank you so much for making it. It's really great.
I honestly, like, I made it, you know, the pandemic started, I was going through some personal things as well, and it felt like a game that I needed to make, and it just all came together. It's like it wanted to live and be a game. I can't explain it. It just came naturally to me.
That's that kind of mythological Hattori Hanzo energy. That's like, it just happened, you know, like Jumanji or something. I love it. Well, this is it. Thank you so much for joining us in IndieViews.
Thank you.
And everyone go buy it on Steam right now.
Thank you very much.
And that was our interview with Lucy Blundell, aka Kinmoku. A huge thanks to Lucy for joining us on IndieViews. It was an absolute treat to get to chat with them, and we're so appreciative of the time and insight that they gave us into Videoverse. Videoverse is available right now on Steam, and as someone who's personally had a fantastic time with it, I would seriously recommend giving the game a go. As of right now, you can pick up Videoverse on Steam and GOG, and as of April 19th, it'll also be available on the Epic Store, so plenty of places to purchase. You can find Lucy on Twitter and Instagram at GamesByKinmoku with no spaces, and you can find links to the game and the social pages in the description below. Thank you so much for tuning in to our new season of IndieViews. If you haven't listened to season 1 from 2023, I'd highly recommend it, as we interviewed a ton of incredible developers, so the interviews are well worth listening to. Thank you again for tuning in, and I hope you come back for the next episode of IndieViews.